If-then. An if-then statement, or an if-then logical relation, provides us with two things we can do validly and two things we tend to do that are invalid. So that we have something actually in mind, let's take an example. If he's breathing, then he's alive. Now, when we're dealing with logic, we're dealing with logical relations, not necessarily any particular instance. So what's actually being taught here are the general inferential rules with regard to if-then statements. I'm only illustrating it with a case that happens to be true because it makes it easier for us to think about it. In other words, don't get too bogged down on the example. Think about the logic behind it. When presented with the if-then logical relation, we have two valid and two invalid things we can do with it. The valid options, i.e., the two ways we can correctly reason or make an inference from an if-then logical relation are: we could affirm the antecedent, which is saying yes to the if part, then yes to the then part. In other words, we confirm that the individual is breathing and conclude that he is alive. This is logically valid. It follows, necessarily, provided the if-then relation is true. The other valid use of the if-then relation, denying the consequent. In other words, saying no to the then part and then no to the if part, which for our example would be, he's not alive, therefore he's not breathing. This is necessarily the case whenever the if-then relation holds. Not just for this example, but logically for any example. Your two valid inferential uses of the if-then logical relation are: you can A the A, affirm the antecedent, say yes to the if, then yes to the then, and you can D the C, deny the consequent, say no to the then no to the if. You can A the A and D the C. So what are the two invalid moves? The two incorrect logical moves or inferences that we tend to make when we encounter if-then logical relations. The invalid moves are affirming the consequent, which is saying yes to the then part, then yes to the if part. Here that would look like saying, he's alive, therefore he's breathing. This is not necessarily logically true. It can always follow that he's alive from the fact that he's breathing, but it need not necessarily always follow from the fact, given our if-then relation, that if he's alive, he's breathing. If you've taken a CPR course, then you see how this holds up with the example. The other invalid move we tend to make with if-then logical relations is denying the antecedent, which is saying no to the if part and then no to the then part. For example, he's not breathing, therefore he's not alive. The logical statement says that he is alive if he is breathing. The logical statement does not say he is only alive if he's breathing. If you're ever choking on something, hopefully the people around you, who might be able to help, don't conclude that if you're not breathing, you're not alive. So there's two moves that you can't make validly with if-then statements, with an if-then logical relation. You can't A the C. You can't affirm the consequent. You can't say yes to the then part, then yes to the if part. You can't D the A. You can't deny the antecedent. You can't say no to the if part, then no to the then part. You can A the A and D the C, but you can't A the C or D the A. But let's take a note here from the humor lecture, because you, on some cool fundamental level, actually understand these logical relations and rules. We know this in part because you find things funny that break the rules.
Therefore, I'm a celebrity that will sell like hotcakes.
You might need to think about getting a job.
Get a job? Serious?
Yeah.
I have a job. Do you know what my job is? I save the planet.
Yeah.
Maybe you should get a job.
I have a job.
Really?
know what my job
Hitting the machine with the words that come out of it? Oh, this is knowledge. Knowledge is power. No, it's not. Knowledge is not power. That's power. The brain is a muscle. And that's a muscle, and that's a muscle, and they are all muscles, this is all muscle, so I am covered in brains, and I have more brains than you.
The brain is a muscle, so I am covered in brains and have more brains than you. Now, we know he made some sort of mistake here, and it turns out that it's a basic logical mistake. He found a true if-then relationship. He found the relationship, knowledge is power. If you have brains, then you have muscle. There's a bit of term ambiguity here. There's a bit of ambiguity of terms here, but philosophical charitability is a virtue. The relation he found was, if brains, then muscle. We could stretch it out a bit to, all brains are muscle. But this does not mean, necessarily, that all muscle is brains. It's not impossible, but it's certainly not logically necessary for muscle to equal brains wherever brains are muscle. So Thor Odinson comes up with, if brains then muscle, and he would have some valid uses of this new knowledge is power meme that he's picked up. The valid uses include, I have brains, therefore I have muscle. And again, we're being charitable here. So this is affirming the antecedent. Or he could come up with, if one has no muscle, then one has no brains. Because imagine the entirety of the muscle circle disappeared, the entirety of the brain's circle would disappear as well. Because the brain's circle is subsumed within the muscle circle. So those are the two valid things that Thor could have done with his new knowledge. His new concept that knowledge is power. But of course, with this concept, with this if-then relation, comes invalid uses of it. He could conclude, for example, that if he has muscle, then he has brains. He could affirm the consequent. Now, the logical issue with this is that it doesn't necessarily follow. Why? Because there's plenty of muscle that isn't brains. So acquiring more muscle doesn't mean acquiring more brains necessarily. So this is logically an invalid move because you could gain muscle that's not brains. Or you could have muscle that isn't brains. The other incorrect inference that Thor could make is, no brains, therefore no muscle, so he could deny the antecedent. What would happen if you took out all the brains? Well, it looks like there'd still be a lot of muscle left. So saying no to the if part, and then no to the then part, would in this case be wrong, because not all muscle equals brains. Another example.
But I want to thank my family. They say that funny people often come from a difficult childhood or a troubled family. So to my family, I say, they're giving me the Mark Twain Prize for American humor. What did you animals do to me?
This is another case of affirming the consequent, saying yes to the then and then yes to the if. If bad childhood, then funny, funny therefore bad childhood, affirming the consequent. She can't validly conclude from the if-then statement, if you have a bad childhood, then you'll be funny, that she had a bad childhood because she was funny, because the if-then statement doesn't imply complete overlap of bad childhood and funny. So she can be wrong if she got some of the funny that happens to not come from a bad childhood. A denying the antecedent version of this joke, in other words, if Tina Fey had created a joke from this if-then statement by making the other invalid inference, denying the antecedent, it might go something like, they say funny people often come from a difficult childhood, but my childhood was great, so you guys are all wrong. I'm not actually funny. And with the right delivery, that might actually work. Next, a family classic, Captain Ron. Now for background, Martin is a family man looking to take his wife and 2 kids on a sailing trip. After numerous other misadventures, they end up in a squall, a storm, and these lines come right after Captain Ron loses their navigation charts and their compass.
Everybody listen to me! Listen to me! The boss is right! We should be okay! Because I know we're near land! Wait, Cap, wait! Do you hear that? We're almost there! Explain to the kids how you know that, Captain. All right, now stay with me. When we left, we had just enough fuel to make it to San Juan. And We are out of fuel!
Now what Captain Ron knows is if they make it to San Juan, then they'll be out of fuel. This is a true statement, or true enough for him to validly conclude two things, but being an if-then relation, it also opens him up to making a couple types of mistakes. The particular mistake he makes is the same one just made by Tina Fey and the God of Thunder before her. Captain Ron says yes to the then part of the if-then statement, and then yes to the if. He says, we're out of fuel, therefore we're at San Juan. He affirms the consequent, one of the two things you can't do. You can A the A and D the C, but you can't A the C or D the A. You can say yes to the if, then yes to the then, and you can say no to the then no to the if, but you can't say yes to the then yes to the if, and you can't say no to the if, then no to the then. A denying the antecedent version of this joke, in other words, if the screenwriters had created a joke from this if-then statement by making the other invalid inference, saying no to the if, then no to the then, it might be Captain Ron saying that the fuel gauge must be broken, because it says they're at a fuel, but they aren't at San Juan, so they can't be at a fuel. Elementary logic. So here are your rules all on one page. When you have an if-then logical relation, you can A the A and D the C, but you can't A the C or D the A. Put the long way, you can say yes to the if, then yes to the then, and say no to the then no to the if, but you can't say yes to the then yes to the if, or say no to the if, then no to the then. Now let's use our knowledge to test an if-then statement to see whether it holds up. This is the Wason selection task with which you may be familiar. Each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other. We are testing to see whether an if-then statement is correct. We get to flip over two cards, and the two cards that we get to flip over should correspond to the two valid forms of interaction with if-then statements. The other two cards correspond to invalid ways of interacting with if-then statements. So if we flip either of the two valid cards, then they are good tests of the if-then statement, because a violation of the if-then rule, in the cases that should be valid, shows you that the if-then rule is not being followed. Our if-then statement is, if the card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. In other words, if vowel, then even number. So our task is to find the two cards representative of the valid interpretations of the logical rule. We get to turn two cards over, and the two cards we turn over we want to be the two valid cards. Now the first one is admittedly a freebie. The if-then statement is if vowel, then even number. So obviously you're going to flip the vowel to see whether there's an even number on the other side. You just follow the statement. This is A-ing the A, affirming the antecedent, or, if we were in a logic course, modus ponens reasoning. Note that flipping the A, or the vowel, could either corroborate the rule. If it has an even number on it, it corroborates the rule, or it could discorroborate, disconfirm, or disprove that the rule is being followed. If you flip this A over, if you flip this vowel over, and you find an odd number on it, then this rule is being broken. Or, a more intuitive way to put this that connects with people better is the rule lied to you. The rule said if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side, but it has an odd number on the other side. The if-then statement is a lie. If we flip over this vowel card and it's even, we've confirmed the rule, and if we flip it over and it's odd, we've disconfirmed or falsified the rule. Visually, we know if we flip this over and it happens to be an odd number, we know that there is at least one case where the vowel does not correspond to an even number. So the correct drawing of our if-then statement, up in the upper right corner, is wrong. We could be dealing with a partial affirmative type of situation here, where some vowels are on a card with an even number, or maybe no vowels are on cards with even numbers. Regardless, if we flip the A and it has an odd number on the other side, The if-then rule has been broken and falsified. But that one was rather obvious. It's of course the second option that actually trips people up. The second test is not how we're used to thinking. This is denying the consequent, or modus tollens reasoning. What's our second choice? The rule is, if the card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. Denying the consequent is saying no to the then no to the if. So which card corresponds to the negation of the then statement? Keep in mind that all cards have a number on one side and a letter on the other. That rule is not being tested. It is never broken. It is an eternal truth. What we're testing is this if-then statement, and what I'm scaffolding you through is picking the card that would deny the consequent. This is where you should write down or somehow make visible your thinking. Doing that is the first step towards putting together an argument for it, and it's figuring out the argument that lets you teach yourself you're wrong, which is far more important than finding out why you're right. The card that denies the consequent is the one with an odd number on it. Specifically, if we flip over an odd-numbered card and it has a vowel on the other side, then the rule has lied to us. Rule, you said that if a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other side. But look, I just found this odd number and I flipped him over and he had a vowel on the other side. You're wrong, Rule. You lied to me. One of the reasons this may not be intuitive to us is that we can only disconfirm the claim with this card selection. If it's a vowel, then we've disconfirmed the rule, falsified it. But if it's a consonant, well then it's irrelevant. But if it's a vowel, then, we don't know how to diagram this. What would be the actual proposition that maps this reality out? Maps vowels to even numbers on cards. But what about the other cards? What about the two mistakes that we can make? Well, the typical wrong answer is to seek more confirmation. This is the error of affirming the consequent, A-ing the C, saying yes to the then part, and then yes to the if part, which is wrong because the claim if vowel then number does not mean if number then vowel. If you make it to San Juan, you'll be out of fuel. Doesn't mean you're out San Juan if you're out of fuel. So which card corresponds to affirming the consequent? Saying yes to the then part. Flipping over the even number, which is not a valid test of the rule. Your justification might be something like, well, I'm going to flip over the even number and then see if it has a vowel on it. Well, fine, if it happens to have a vowel on it, then maybe that feels like it corroborates the rule. I certainly wouldn't argue it was a coincidence. But what if you happen to flip it over and it's a consonant? Well, that doesn't falsify anything, because if it happens to be a consonant, it could just be one of the even numbers in even number space that happens to not have a vowel on the side of it. Note that the two valid card flips, the two that actually test whether the if-then statement is true, can both falsify the rule, which is the point, to try to falsify and see whether falsification occurs. One of the reasons this example is so powerful is because it's an analogy, or it's a model for how your brain works with problems. How your brain works with ideas, ideologies, beliefs, concepts, values. If you run a first initial test, if you flip over that initial A, and the first test corroborates the thing you're assessing, the next move of a scientist would be to move on to a more rigorous test. The next move of your brain tends to be to look for more confirmation, which is the best that flipping over even-numbered card could do. The other answer that very few students pick, although some people do choose it, is the one that corresponds with denying the antecedent. Flipping over the consonant card does nothing to test the if vowel then even number claim. Say you flip it over and there's an even number on it. That's irrelevant, because nobody said that all even numbers have vowels on the other side. Alright, so say you flip it over and it has an odd number on the other side. Well, then it's all kinds of irrelevant. I think that students who pick this card probably forget the rules, and they think maybe there could be an A on the other side, but we've set up the rules of the universe such that there's always a number on one side and a letter on the other. So flipping B is all kinds of pointless. An activity for you to do. The rule is, if the lights are on, someone is home. We're seeing whether this rule holds up. So from left to right, the house card says, somebody's home. Let's see whether the light's on. The light bulb with a not sign over it says the lights aren't on. Let's see if somebody's home. The light bulb says the lights are on. Let's see if somebody's home. And the house with a not sign over it says nobody's home. Let's see whether the lights are on. Which of these cards, then, corresponds to affirming the antecedent? In the notes will be the answers. I want you to write down your answer. Which corresponds with denying the consequent? Moving on to improper ways to test the if-then statement, which card shows the poor choice of affirming the consequent? And which card shows denying the antecedent? What does this have to do with context, the subject of this lecture? It turns out that the task you are given, or the role that you have, or the schema that's active when you're testing if-then relations, influences the decisions that you tend to make, at least in Wason selection tasks. And this is a good thing, since those schemas form the situation that in some cases mean that errors are fatal or more important. Pragmatic approaches ask what you are doing with something, not what the task is, but what is it accomplishing. First, having a rationale improves Wason card task performance. Let's imagine a scenario where you are an immigration officer at the international airport in China. Among the documents you have to check is a sheet called Form H. One side of the form indicates whether the passenger is entering the country or in transit, the first two boxes there, while the other side of the form lists names of diseases. You have to make sure that if the form says entering on one side, then the other side includes COVID among the list of diseases. Which of the following forms or cards would you have to turn over to check? Indicate only the two that you need to check to be sure. Now, what I just gave you were the instructions for the no rationale condition. I did not specifically tell you why you were checking the if entering then COVID relation. Around 60% of participants choose the two correct cards in this no rationale condition. The correct cards being the ones on the far left, A the A, and the far right, D the C. To dramatically improve performance on the same task, we only need to add a reason or rationale for checking Form H. For that rationale condition, you only need to add a single sentence. That sentence is, this is to ensure that entering passengers are protected against the disease. Adding this sentence brought correct performance up from 60% to 90%. The same task, same role, same stimuli, we just added why. We gave participants a rationale. Note that the original research used hepatitis, typhoid, and cholera as the then diseases. COVID wasn't there. This notion of pragmatic schemas was further distilled down into the idea of deontic selection, or permission schemas. Reviewed in last lecture's reading, Minda's Psychology of Thinking, pages 140 to 142, is the idea of deontic selection. That is, choosing the cards based on rules, which seem to remind us to select the cards based on what's not there, i.e. those without COVID on their Form H do not have permission to enter China. The insight from Cheng and Holyoake in 1985 was that confirmation bias may produce so many errors, i.e. only 60% accuracy, because the alternative, the correct approach, the use of disconfirmatory evidence, denying the consequent, is impractical in everyday life. Denying the consequent is often not our default approach unless we are thinking in terms of permission or limitation. This is because permission schemas remind us of what one cannot do, such as enter China without being vaccinated for COVID. And they get us to look for rule violators, or, as I've already mentioned, liars. Now let's take a look at some if-then statements in the wild. First off, this construction is foundational. The Wason card selection task has been called the reason why cognitive psychology and psychology of thinking exists as a field of study. So let's see how fundamental it is. how ubiquitous the if-then construction is. The Socratic universal statement, all men are mortal, is an if-then statement. If man, then mortal. Not identical, but we can certainly treat it that way. And all that we know about how we can interact with if-then statements does apply. All men are mortal if man, then mortal. Socrates is a man. The minor premise of this classic syllogism is an affirmation of the antecedent. It's saying yes to the if. And then the conclusion is just the rest of the affirmation. It's saying yes to the then. So, what if Socrates is not a man? Is he then immortal? Which error would that be? It would be D'ing the A, denying the antecedent. What if Socrates is mortal? Could we conclude from his being mortal that he is a man? Well, which error is that? Aing the C, affirming the consequent. Just to throw a stone at you now, consider a compound syllogism, which is just a syllogism that begins with a compound proposition. Like if then, either or both and. Sam is either joking or serious. This is a disjunctive proposition. If he smiles, then he's not serious. So line 1 shows us we have a disjunctive proposition. It's an either or, and since this compound syllogism starts with a disjunctive proposition, it's a disjunctive syllogism. The second line is our if-then statement. Third, we have an affirmation of an antecedent. And fourth, we have a logical conclusion. Smiling rules out serious, and since our only other entertained or formalized option was joking, we conclude that he's joking. I include this example because it's likely reflective of actual thinking, and it illustrates that compound syllogisms, despite having only 3 terms, just like normal syllogisms, and despite seeming to be roughly the same thing as our previous examples, are their own beast. Our Euler circles will not do an adequate job of diagramming this syllogism, and Aristotelian rules don't apply. Only attempt to diagram this argument if you would like your brain to hurt. If you try it, then your brain will hurt. That's an if-then statement we've just encountered in the wild. If you try it, then your brain will hurt. Trying it means hurt brain. So you can affirm the antecedent. Not having a hurt brain means you didn't try it. Well, good, yeah, because if you had tried it, then your brain would hurt. So if your brain doesn't hurt, then you didn't try it. All right, it's denying the consequent. But having brain pain does not necessarily mean that you tried it. That would be affirming the consequent, and not trying it doesn't ensure an absence of brain pain. Because we're not saying that diagramming a compound syllogism is the only thing that can give you brain pain. That would be denying the antecedent. Next, Aristotle's 6 rules. Last lecture, we learned that there are 2 things that can go wrong with an argument, aside from having ambiguous terms, in which case you don't really have an argument. The 2 things that can go wrong with an argument are, 1, it could have false premises, which generally is a matter for judgment, not logic. Or 2, the conclusion could not follow from the premises. In other words, the argument could be invalid. Aristotle's 6 rules for checking syllogisms allow us to see whether simple syllogisms, at least, are valid. If they break any of the rules, they are invalid. We have 2 rules about structure, 2 rules about distribution of terms, and 2 rules about negative propositions. First, a syllogism must have 3 and only 3 terms. So, in the classic syllogism we have, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Your 3 terms are men, mortal, and Socrates. Last lecture, we considered this abomination of reasoning. Let's count our terms. Robots, 6'3" people, Brian, Candy, and Canada. Now this one breaks a bunch of other rules too, but it certainly breaks the only 3 terms rule. Next, a syllogism must have 3 and only 3 propositions. Specifically, a major premise, which will have the major term, that is the predicate of the conclusion, a minor premise, the subject of which is the subject of the conclusion, and the conclusion. Major, minor, and conclusion. Adding a proposition makes it by definition something other than a syllogism, or an entirely different form of syllogism. I mentioned that we were breaking this rule in our Karen example from last lecture before I made it okay by showing that we were actually making a Sorites. Note that this example also violates the 3 terms rule by adding a 4th term, Karen. If anyone is distracted when I use this example by the fact that the internet has recently decided to use Karen as a derogatory term, Then this is a good example of the weed theory of memes. The meme, the Karen meme, is trying to activate, replicate, grow, spread itself in your brain despite not being bidden or intended by you, and despite its activation coming at an actual cost to you in the form of distraction or irrelevance. If you don't know what I mean, then just bin this as irrelevant. Next, the fallacy of the undistributed middle. The middle term must be distributed at least once. The middle term, in logic, is the one that does not appear in the conclusion. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You have your three terms, men, mortal, and Socrates. Which of those three terms doesn't show up in the conclusion sentence? It's man. Therefore, man is the middle term. Distribution refers to whether the term makes a claim about all of something. For example, all men are mortal. That's a distributed term. Another example would be no fish are birds. You're saying something about all fish, that none of them are birds. So the term fish is distributed because you're claiming to know something about all of that thing. We'll go through each type of proposition here. If I say all men are mortal, then I'm making a claim to know something about all men. My subject term, men, is distributed in my major premise. My middle term is distributed. I am indeed claiming to know something about all men. If I say no men are mortal, then I am making a claim that I know something about all men, so my subject term men is distributed again in my major premise. And in this proposition case, I'm claiming to know something about all mortal things, specifically that none of them are men. So my major premise's predicate, mortal or mortality, is also distributed. Note that here our knowledge of the predicate term is also distributed in the conclusion predicate, where I am claiming to know something about all of mortality in my conclusion, namely that all of mortality does not contain Socrates. If I say some men are mortal, then I'm neither claiming to know something about all men nor all mortal things. So I've not distributed anything, not my subject, not my predicate. So it's appropriate then that no term is distributed in the conclusion as well. In other words, no claim to know about the mortality of Socrates can be validly made in the conclusion. The middle term, the one that does not appear in the conclusion, is not distributed. No claim to know about all of it is made. So, to make a conclusion from the other two terms would be fallacious, hence all the question marks. Note, of course, that this does not mean that we can say nothing about Socrates and his possible mortality. It just means that we need different thinking tools, probabilistic ones, to come to an understanding here. Finally, if I say some men are not mortal, then I'm not claiming to know something about all men, the subject of my major premise, and also the middle term, but I am claiming to know something about all of mortality. Specifically, I somehow know that some men lie outside of it. It's again appropriate that no term is distributed in the conclusion. We cannot validly conclude things about the other two terms if the middle term is not distributed. Again, this does not mean that we can say nothing about Socrates and his possible mortality. We just need different thinking tools, probabilistic ones, to tackle what we can or should conclude about what we know. Note that the four A-E-I-O proposition type arguments presented all have predicates in their first two premises that are different, i.e. the two syllogism premises have different predicates, specifically mortal and man. We had an example of an undistributed middle with our penguin cartoon. All penguins are black and white. Good. Penguins is now a distributed term because we made a claim to know something about all penguins. Next premise, some old TV shows are black and white. Okay, well, neither of these terms are distributed in this premise. Conclusion, therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. Well, there are a few ways that this is terrible, but one simple way to know this syllogism is invalid is that the middle term, black and white, the one not appearing in the conclusion, is not distributed. No claim to know about the entirety of black and white things has been made. Just observing this fact is enough to say the conclusion does not follow. Note that the other diagnostic red flag, namely that the predicates of the two premises are the same, X are black and white, also show that this is not a proper syllogism. It is reasoning by analogy. But it's absurdly common, a demonstration of the commonality of this version of the fallacy of the undistributed middle, specifically the case where the predicates of both premises are the same, is Godwin's law of the internet. Wait long enough, and any discussion will eventually lead to something being grouped with Hitler or Nazis. You know who had anti-smoking campaigns? Hitler's Nazi Germany. The implied argument being, the government wants to restrict my smoking, Nazis wanted to restrict smoking, therefore the government is a Nazi one. The predicates of both premises are the same, wants to restrict smoking. So, this is reasoning by analogy, or an attempt at reasoning via syllogism that's committed the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Next rule, now that we have an idea of what distribution means. In the Socrates A syllogism, mortal is undistributed. That's okay, because we don't need to know about all mortal things, just all men, and that Socrates is a man. Recall that the major term of a syllogism is the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor term of a syllogism is the subject of that conclusion. So, here, in our conclusion, the subject is Socrates, and the predicate is mortal. The minor term is Socrates, and the major term is mortal. Going all the way back to a few minutes ago, we looked at this syllogism as an if-then relation. In that case, the error of denying the antecedent, saying Socrates is not a man, and concluding that he is therefore not mortal, would be an example of the fallacy of the illicit major. It is an illicit major fallacy because it is the major term, the predicate of the conclusion, that is not distributed in the premise, but was distributed in its conclusion. In other words, the conclusion claims to know something about all mortal things, namely that Socrates is not included in them, but this was not established in the premises. In other words, the syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is not a man, therefore Socrates is not mortal, claims in its conclusion to have knowledge of all mortal things, specifically that they do not contain Socrates. But its premises did not claim or establish to have this knowledge of all mortal things. The universal affirmative, all men are mortal, only distributes or claims to have knowledge of all men. For the sake of completion, an example here of an illicit minor fallacy. All Avengers are superheroes. All Avengers are in Avengers Endgame. Therefore, all superheroes are in Avengers Endgame. Not quite. We have illicitly distributed the subject, or minor term of the conclusion. Superheroes was not distributed in the premises, so it is invalid to distribute it in the conclusion. In other words, we are claiming in the conclusion to know something about all superheroes, but we did not establish that in the premises. Other examples of the fallacy of the illicit minor include all dogs are animals, all dogs are mammals, therefore all animals are mammals. The fallacy of the illicit minor is a fun one to watch if you get forced into listening to people talk about politics. All X vote Y, all X are Z, therefore all Y voters are Z. You can fill in the placeholders with your own values, pardon the pun. Next, no syllogism can have two negative premises, or more precisely, no conclusion logically follows when you have two negative premises. Establishing separation from one thing does not establish overlap with another, not without some other premise. No ducks are geese, no geese are blue, therefore no ducks are blue? Some ducks are not geese, some geese are not blue, therefore some ducks are blue? Just doesn't follow. Nothing's been established. It's just separation. There's no overlap to conclude. Nothing's been put together. It's just been pulled apart. Finally, if one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. And if the conclusion is negative, one premise must be negative. Most logic courses treat these as separate rules. It's pretty straightforward. There's only one notable case where we really want to derive a negative from two positives. I'll give you a version of it. All shirts are clothing. All clothing is made by humans. Therefore, some things made by humans are not shirts. Well, the concluding sentence is true. It's just not logically derivable from the premises. It doesn't follow. If we want to conclude that there are more things in the human-made and the clothing categories than just shirts, then we need to establish these facts in the premises. Finally, a good rule for those arguments that make your head hurt. If one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Some students are not strong in math. All math majors are strong in math. Therefore, some math majors are students. Well, I know it's true, but does it follow? Well, no. A negative premise with an affirmative conclusion means invalid reasoning has occurred. You don't have to do any other diagramming or anything. It just broke one of the rules. It contains a negative premise, but it has an affirmative conclusion. Therefore, you know it doesn't follow. So, there, as nutshelled as they can be, are Aristotle's rules. Now we'll talk about some of the context in your brain that influences how we interact with these rules. And let's call this your inner context. Recall that we swear most often in the language we learned first, generally, and that we report curse words for our first language as having more force. It has more observable autonomic response like skin conductance, more sweating if we're criticized in our first language. Now consider something called the trolley problem, which you may have heard of. An out-of-control trolley is going to kill 5 people at the end of its track. You, being an engineer, you can stop the trolley, and you can save 5 people. In this version of the trolley problem, you, the engineer, know you can save these 5 people, but in order to save them, you have to push a large person in front of the trolley to stop the trolley. So the large person will die, but you save the other 5 people. Do you save the 5 people by pushing the large person and killing the large person, or do you let the trolley kill the 5 people? That's your choice. When we put this question to people, most would not push the large person. 20% say that they would push the large person, and 80% choose no. They would let the 5 people die and not push the large person. But these are the results when we ask people in their first language. What happens when we ask individuals in their second language the exact same question? This is, of course, a between groups study. We're not just asking them the exact same question in another language. We're asking different people the same question. We're comparing averages across groups. When we ask people in their second language this version of the trolley problem, half of them say they would push the large person. So we've gone from 20% to 50%, asking the exact same question, but simply doing so in people's secondary language. So this reinforces what we were talking about in Lecture 4, which is that your first language seems a little more wired up into your System 1 affective schemas and spreading activation, whereas when we ask you in your second language, your System 2 is less pressured or less overrun by this System 1 activation, and tends to come to a more utilitarian conclusion. So your primary language is associated with more guilt, more sensitivity to harm, more sensitivity to swearing and reprimands, even expressions of love. And your second language is a little more hooked into the slow, analytical, and less affective System 2, or at least proportionally more hooked into this system. Regardless of which answer is correct to the trolley problem, the implication here is that our abstract reasoning is very determined by emotional experience, even when we are not being or feeling emotional. And whether and to what extent this emotional experience is applied to our reasoning depends on arbitrary context, like the language in which something is asked. I choose the trolley problem results because many people consider the trolley problem to be one of the foundational ways we assess ethics and how people judge basic moral questions. This particular iteration taught philosophers that we're not really utilitarians if it involves getting our hands dirty. An important decision, very influenced by very arbitrary context. Conflict syllogisms are syllogisms whose conclusions go against our beliefs, or attitudes, or expectations. we tend to misinterpret conflict syllogisms. We more often conclude that a valid conflict syllogism, one that follows, is actually invalid. In other words, we will conclude quite often that the conclusion does not follow from the premises if it's a conflict syllogism. So you could say that the conflict here is a conflict between our system 1, our beliefs, our expectations, and system 2, the cool, slow, deliberative, symbol-using decipherer and applier of basic rules. An example for clarity: success is the product of hard work and intelligence. Justin Trudeau is successful. Therefore, Trudeau is hardworking and intelligent. Now, some conservatives might, despite endorsing the premises, because the first one sounds good, the second one sounds good, they might refuse to believe the conclusion, in which case you have an override of System 2. In the conflict between System 1, how one feels, one's political beliefs, how one typically tackles problems, and System 2, what one can put together correctly using rules, System 1 wins because the individual doesn't believe the conclusion. They say, this syllogism is invalid. It actually doesn't follow. This same person would have other options, though. So you could realize that if you're endorsing the premises, you should believe the conclusion. So you do believe the conclusion. You say that the syllogism is valid. And therefore you would discover that you actually believe that Justin Trudeau is hardworking and intelligent. Here, your System 2 overrides your System 1, which is what Keith Stanovich called heuristic override. But of course there's a third option, which is negotiate, or play the diplomacy card. So you can renegotiate the premises. Well, what exactly do we mean by successful? What exactly do we mean by hardworking and intelligent? Every word or term is in part determined by the context in which it is intended or used. So maybe rather than coming to a conclusion, we need to come to terms with the argument. But research into conflict syllogisms says that quite often we will take the first option. If it goes against our beliefs, we will honestly think, that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. My-side bias is a subtype of confirmation bias, which is quite large. Many things fall under confirmation bias. My-side bias is when people evaluate evidence, generate evidence, and test hypotheses in a manner biased toward their own prior opinions and attitudes, according to Stanovich, West, and Toplik. There's good reasons to have my-side bias. Your side, and all of the things that come with it, are probably neatly cultivated by you. I have these friends because I chose them, and I chose them because they're better than other people. I have these beliefs because I curated them, chose them because they're better than other beliefs. And we're naturally wired up to protect things that are ours. There's all kinds of good reasons to have my-side bias. And not all bias is error, but it does play a big role in the errors that we make, especially when we're reasoning with each other and about each other. So what do we know about my-side bias? Well, firstly, and probably most interestingly, it is nearly completely independent of IQ. In other words, having more intelligence, more abstracting power, does not protect you from my-side bias. We also see it influencing ethical and logical decision-making. A way I like to phrase my-side bias is, if something is in the you category, this influences how you think and reason about it. A subfamily of my-side bias is motivated reasoning. When you are explicitly reasoning and you are displaying my-side bias, then you can call it motivated reasoning. Some examples include, if we're diagnosed with a disease, we tend to rate it as less severe for everybody. When we're faced with a random draw, we tend to exaggerate the chance of an outcome in our favor. So if I bought 2 tickets to a 50-50 draw and you bought 2 tickets to a 50-50 draw, something in my brain says that my tickets are better and I have a better chance of winning than you. One of the ways we've demonstrated this is people will put a higher price value on their tickets compared to somebody else's ticket, even though the draw is random. They have no way of knowing which ticket will win. Other examples, since we've talked about IQ, the lower you score on an intelligence test, the less valid you think it will be for everybody. A place where this might be a little more important: if you use a substance, coffee, cigarettes, you are less likely to believe the evidence that this substance could cause harm. Not just to yourself, but to anyone. So motivated reasoning and my-side bias can have real consequences. An example of a my-side bias result. We asked U.S. students According to a comprehensive study by the U.S. Department of Transportation, a particular German car is 8 times more likely than a typical family car to kill occupants of another car in a crash. The U.S. Department of Transportation is considering recommending a ban on the sale of this German car. Do you think that the United States should ban the sale of this car? Do you think that this car should be allowed on U.S. streets? So we asked students, should the German vehicle be banned and should it not be permitted on U.S. roads? This is a my side bias study, so you could probably predict what's coming next. Next is going to be the same story, except the car isn't German, the car is American. According to a comprehensive study by the U.S. Department of Transportation, Ford Explorers are 8 times more likely than a typical family car to kill occupants of another car in a crash. The Department of Transportation in Germany is considering recommending a ban on the sale of the Ford Explorer in Germany. Do you think that Germany should ban the sale of the Ford Explorer? Should the Ford Explorer be allowed on German streets, just like other cars? Note that it's the same question. Everything is perfectly symmetrical. The source of the information is the same, but it's U.S. students being asked. So, when we ask them, should the German vehicle be banned, 78.4% say yes. Should it be not permitted on U.S. roads, 73.7% said yes. Should not be permitted. What about when it's a U.S. manufactured vehicle and we're talking about protecting Germans? Only 51.4% say it should be banned, and only 39.2% say it shouldn't be allowed on the roads. And Stanovich, West, and Toplik note that my side bias in this naturalistic between subjects design was completely independent of cognitive ability. Intelligence or IQ is not going to help you be more objective on this question. Not if you're not applying specific thinking tools for the task. But what about strictly logical tasks? First, even with university students who are freshly trained explicitly in syllogism interpretation, we find my side bias. But here at least, we find that if we emphasize decoupling our opinions from the logical task, or decontextualizing the syllogism from your other relevant knowledge, then your intelligence appears to provide a boost. Quoting the paper, correlations with cognitive ability appear when participants receive explicit instructions to decouple prior belief, which sensitize participants to the fact that decontextualization is a necessary requirement of the task. The correlation occurs because participants of differing cognitive abilities have different levels of computational power available for the override operations that make decoupling possible. This accounts for the correlation between cognitive ability and the magnitude of the belief bias demonstrated in these more formal reasoning situations. End quote. In other words, intelligence helps with the difficult task of not letting your my side bias get in the way, but we tend not to do this task without being explicitly instructed or reminded to. In other words, higher IQ predicts more accurate interpretation of conflict syllogisms, but only after reminders to decontextualize or decouple. My side bias in the wild. We tend to think that we know more about our friends than our friends know about us. And this scales. So our friends constitute a group, and we will also think that our group knows more about other groups than those groups know about our group. And this is a basic observation. The basic observation is that we can't all be right, that we know more than other people. If everybody thinks they're above average, then more than half of people are wrong, because some of them are average, so they're not above average, and roughly half of them are below average. So if everybody thinks they're above average, more than half of them are wrong. And since we tend to see this bias wherever groups exist, wherever you identify as a group or with a group, the more groups we have, the more error we have in our assessments. So by virtue of you being separate from your friend, you have error, because both you and your friend think that you know more about each other than the other knows about you. But you and your friend constitute a group. And you, as a group with your friend, think that you know more about other friend dyads than other friend dyads know about you. But maybe the other friend dyads are other people that live in your little neighborhood, and you think that people in your neighborhood know more about people from the neighborhood next to your neighborhood than the people in the neighborhood next to your neighborhood know about your neighborhood. But of course, those two neighborhoods are in the same province, and maybe people in Ontario know more about people in BC than people in BC know about people in Ontario. And maybe Canadians know more about Americans than Americans know about Canadians. Rick Mercer would tend to agree with that. And maybe people in North America know more about people in South America than people in South America know about people in North America. And you don't necessarily need to be scaling up either. You can have a group of just 3 friends. Those 3 friends can be part of all kinds of different groups. So 2 of the 3 friends are liberals, and they think liberals know more about conservatives than conservatives know about liberals. And 2 of the 3 friends are pro-choice, and they think that pro-choice people know more about pro-lifers than pro-lifers know about pro-choicers. But the one who's a pro-lifer thinks that she knows more about pro-choicers than pro-choicers know about her. The title of the study that produced this graph is called You Don't Know Me, But I Know You. The illusion of asymmetric insight. And basically any group that you belong to, if you ask a group of individuals how their group fares in terms of their knowledge about some other group that's in contrast to that group, the average person in any group will say that the members of their group know more about the members of the contrasting group than the members of the contrasting group know about their group. Now we have a nice, easy, ready explanation for this with the availability heuristic. You can think of your knowledge that you have much more easily than you can think about what other people know about you. The point is just that the my-side bias exists, and wherever there are sides you have proliferation of error, with very few exceptions, including this exception, which shows that women think women know more about men than men know about women, and that men think that women know more about men than men know about women. Both groups, despite being contrasting groups, on average believe the same thing about what each other knows about each other. A rare exception to the my-side bias social cognition literature. Next, you may have seen articles about this in the paper. Once in a while, when the election cycle comes around, you see that some people had lawn signs stolen, political lawn signs stolen. Klassen and Ensley studied this in a paper called Motivated Reasoning and Yard Sign Stealing Partisans. Mine is a likable rogue, and yours is a degenerate criminal. They found that we're more bothered when people from other political parties break the law than when people from ours do the same. Klein and Epley found that, unsurprisingly, we think that we, or our group, is more likely to act morally than other people. Specifically, or especially, we tend to think that members of other groups are more likely to do immoral things than members of our group. And this shouldn't be surprising. Just want to show that the knowledge paradigm from before, i.e. the fact that we think other groups, members of other groups, know less about members of our group than we know about members of other groups, extends to more important things than just abstract questions about what other groups know, to assessments of how other groups are likely to act, and how good or moral they could then presumably be seen as being. Moving along, something being in the mine category also influences how we think and reason about it. There's been quite a few studies using small objects like pencils and mugs that have shown that we will put a much higher price tag on something if we happen to own it, or if we, in a hypothetical experiment, are asked to imagine that we own something versus just that something exists or that somebody else owns something. The monetary value we will assign to something that we are imagining we own versus we're not imagining we own is quite a bit higher. This is called the endowment effect. So we estimate higher values for things that we own, or something that we're just pretending that we own, compared to the exact same thing when we see other people owning them, or nobody owning them. And one could see how this is self-serving, because the endowment effect says that we would put a lower estimate if we were asked what we would pay for something than we would if we were asked what we would sell that same thing for. But it presents us with the interesting problem that we might feel slighted or ripped off if somebody gives us the amount we would pay for something in order to buy it from us. And if we're so irrational when the only thing at stake is an imaginary pencil, then we can only guess how powerfully irrational our thought processes could get when ideas that are actually important to us and maybe part of our self-concept are at stake. There's a special term for when parts of our self-concept may be on the line, and it's called cognitive dissonance. So we get an unpleasant feeling of tension when something we believe about ourselves is being challenged by something we're observing, perhaps our own behavior in the real world. Cognitive dissonance motivates us to resolve the contradiction between our beliefs and our behaviors, but it doesn't always motivate us to do so logically or intelligently. Festinger and Carl Smith's famous measures of performance study, which demonstrated cognitive dissonance, had people do a very tedious task, and then they had to tell someone that it was fun. Or rather, they didn't have to, they were just asked to tell somebody that the task was fun. And most people, when you ask them politely to do something, they'll do it. Now, there were two conditions in this study, though. In condition one, they performed this tedious task and then told somebody it was fun, and they were only paid $1. In condition two, everything was the same. They did the tedious task, and then they told somebody it was fun, but they were paid $20. The cool, counterintuitive observation of Festinger and Carl Smith was that when we later asked individuals whether they thought the task was fun, the group that got paid less reported thinking that the task was more fun. What students in lecture tend to predict is that the participants who got paid more would say it was more fun. But what actually happens is the opposite in this paradigm. And the way this was explained by Festinger and Carl Smith was that an individual is going to have two thoughts in this situation. The first is the thought that we all have about ourselves most of the time, which is that we are honest and good people. Most of us don't identify as pathological liars. The second thought that's creating some dissonance is the fact that they said the task was fun for a certain amount of money. In other words, they're good, honest people, but they lied. So this is creating dissonance. And Festinger and Carl Smith point out that the people who got paid $20 have an easier time reconciling the honest person and I lied thoughts. They can say, well, I lied for the money, and it was enough money to justify an honest person making a little lie. What do I conclude? Well, I'm an honest person. I did what most people would do. It was justified by the paycheck. Cognitive dissonance resolved. Now, whether you agree with that formulation or not, let's treat it charitably and assume that that's what actually happened in the case of the people who got paid $20. It's reasonable. They did a boring task, but they got paid $20, and now they say that they didn't like it, but they got paid enough to lie about it, so that's fine. The group can't say that there was enough money to justify lying. They only got paid $1. So they have the two beliefs: I'm a good, honest person, and I said the task was fun for only $1. How are they going to reconcile this? Well, Festinger and Carl Smith said, in order to get rid of their cognitive dissonance, they have to change their belief about the task. So here you go. I said the task was fun for $1. That's not enough to justify lying, and I'm an honest person, so obviously the task is actually enjoyable. Resolved. I'm still an honest person because I didn't lie. I actually enjoyed it. So to resolve the dissonance, they're even willing to believe that they enjoyed it for the sake of consistency. In the end, we will believe something inaccurate so that we can think our original beliefs, i.e., I'm not a liar, are still accurate. In other words, in this case, we will lie in order to maintain our belief that we are not a liar. So this is an important bug that we have in our software, and people manipulate it. It's a vulnerability that people use. So if I want to get somebody to do something big and illegal with me / for me, I might get them to perform a small illegal action. It's very harmless and maybe well motivated. What I want as someone who's going to manipulate this person into doing something big is I want to establish a little dissonance loop, little dissonance resolution loop in the individual's mind. So I start by getting them to do something that is harmless enough that it will be easy to convince them to do, but that is also questionable in the sense that maybe they shouldn't be doing it. So I've got to find something in that sweet spot, and once they've done that foolish or illegal or ethically questionable thing that wasn't big, but might be enough to leave a lingering bit of dissonance between am I a good person and I did this thing for this other person. Once this is established, I can give this person a control valve for the cognitive dissonance I helped to create by asking them to do something even stupider or bigger or more ethically questionable. Because performing the even more ethically questionable task will answer for them in the affirmative that they were justified in doing the first, only slightly ethically dubious task. The reasoning goes like this. If it was stupid, then I wouldn't do it. I am doing it, therefore it's not stupid. Now this is valid reasoning. This is denying the consequent. It's D'ing the C. But of course, in context, the individual is just doing more and more dumb things in order to convince themselves that the smaller dumb things that they did weren't so dumb. It's a tough circle to be in, and there's a ready example here in situations of relational abuse. So the thought, if you're in an abusive relationship, might go something like this. Well, I'm a respectable person. As a respectable person, I wouldn't tolerate being abused, unless I really loved this person, or unless I really truly believed/know that this person is going to change. So this is setting up a loop, such that more abuse triggers the idea, well, I must really love this person if I'm putting up with this, or I must really believe this person will change if I'm putting up with this. The way you resolve the disconnect between you being a respectable person and your being treated with disrespect is to double down on a belief that should be being disconfirmed by the abusive individual's actions. In other words, abuse strengthens belief that the person will stop abusing. Belief in change becomes strengthened by abuse and by lack of change, due to this particular resolution of the victim's cognitive dissonance. Jim McCormick and Gary Bolton, and some accomplices, were con artists who sold fake bomb detectors to various governments from 1999 to 2010. The detectors were an adaptation of an old golf ball finder scam. It's a piece of plastic that lights up, and it's supposed to be able to find golf balls. The original scam device would sell for about $69, and these enterprising con artists said, what if we told people that it's something much more valuable? What if we called these golf ball detectors bomb detectors? And they made around $100 million selling these bomb detectors to Bahrain, Djibouti, Egypt, Georgia, India, Iraq, Lebanon, Mexico, Niger, Pakistan, Syria, Thailand, and Uzbekistan. They were selling them for thousands of dollars a piece, I think $20,000 or $30,000 a piece. 1,200 were sold to Mexico, and about 5,000 were sold to Iraq. On the left here, we see a state police officer in Hidalgo, Mexico, using one of them in 2012, and on the right, we see a Baghdadi security officer in Baghdad, Iraq, using one of them likely in 2016. Now, the first tests showing that the devices were useless were published in 1999. The sale of the devices was banned by the United Kingdom in 2010, and the final convictions of the scammers occurred in 2013 or 2014. So why were these devices being used in Iraq's capital in 2016? 2 weeks after the United Kingdom court decision against McCormick, several explosions killed dozens in the Iraqi capital. Then Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki called a news conference where he was asked why the devices were still in use. The Prime Minister said he formed several committees to investigate the claims that the devices were fake. Now, there were 3 or 4 rounds of empirical studies where United Kingdom's researchers put them to the test using bombs to see whether they could detect them. It's not a difficult task to run. They could have looked up these studies. Instead, they formed committees. He said that the results found that the devices worked between 20 and 54% of the time. Well, that's better than nothing, if the soldiers knew how to use them correctly. So they're gerrymandering or cherry-picking their data here, and even with that, they're only having 20 to 54% accuracy rates. And then he says, although some devices were fake, others were real. So the scammers gave you some real devices that are identical structurally, just mixed in with the con devices? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Since Abadi took office in 2014, the use of the detectors has continued. So 2014, this is when even the extended accomplices have been charged, and it's been well established that it was a con. Iraq's Interior Minister, Mohammed Ghaban, said that he had inherited the problem and that a committee should be formed to see whether the devices work. Oh good, we're going to form another committee. After yet another bombing in the capital was blamed on the scam devices, Quote, an Arabic hashtag began trending for soup detectors, mocking the absurdity that these handheld devices can detect explosives. The ministry's interior website was hacked, and a picture of a bloodied baby was posted along with the bomb detector bearing the Islamic State's markings, making the point that the fake wands aid only those intent on killing civilians. After being met by angry crowds at the site of the bombing, a body put out a statement: all security forces must take away the handheld detectors from checkpoints, and the Ministry of the Interior must reopen the investigation for corruption in the contracts of these devices and follow all entities which participated in them. Finally, some action from the top. Despite the Prime Minister's statement, journalists in Baghdad reported seeing the wands in use the morning after the order was issued. Why can't the organization or the individuals in the organization accept that the things are fake? We have a few options for how to model this. You can say it's cognitive dissonance after having paid $20,000 or $30,000 each, but it's not the same people that bought them that are in power, so structurally it's probably not cognitive dissonance, though it may be on the part of people who've invested their time and training on the machines. It could be the endowment effect, whereby we overvalue something simply because we own it. It's probably something in the confirmation bias family, maybe motivated reasoning, recalling the times when the detector was correct, and excusing or forgetting when it was wrong. You can take your pick, but there's something within the my side bias family that can help us to make sense of why people charged with protecting their fellow citizens spent so many years continuing to use these scam devices. A little more on your inner context. Persuasion techniques tend to be based on investment that you've made. If I can get you to see yourself spending time looking at something, then it can get you to interpret yourself and your behavior as wanting or liking that thing. Establishing some context, some inner context for a decision that I want you to make later. One version of this is the foot in the door persuasion technique. So if I get you to complete a small transaction with me, it does a few things. First, it establishes a reciprocal relationship. But second, you see yourself as somebody who performs that action, who maybe believes what I say, starting with things that are easy to believe and then moving on to things that are more difficult to believe. The classic example that looked at this was we had two very similar neighborhoods, and we were going to canvass them. We were going to ask for cancer donations. And to half of individuals, we went around first, and we distributed some Let's Fight Cancer stickers. And we just asked them, would you please put this in your window? It cost them nothing. It was a simple, small request, and lots of people did it. So that's a manipulation. We have some individuals who completed that first small transaction, and some who hadn't. So then when we went around asking for cancer donations to be made, not surprisingly, those individuals with whom we had a foot in the door, with whom we'd completed a small transaction, we got more donations from them. With foot in the door, you complete a small transaction, and then hopefully you move on to the bigger one. A related approach is called the lowball technique, which starts with an apparently small transaction, but as time moves forward, as an individual agrees to the small end of the transaction, you try to grow and grow and grow the transaction before completing it. An example joke would be an optometrist is training a new optometrist in how to get more money from people to whom they sell glasses. She tells the trainee, when you're quoting them the price of the glasses, say the price, so it's $100, and then if they don't look surprised at the price, then say, for the lenses. And then if they still don't look surprised at the price, say each. What she's training the new optometrist to do is get the most out of the transaction, which is what car salespeople try to do. And they're adding in, the rust proofing and the scotch guarding and extra features, trying to upsell. I've got you on for this much, let's try to get you on for a little bit more. So the lowball approach starts with a small thing, but adds to it. So would you believe this little thing, or would you agree to this little thing? An example from a friend of mine, she was looking for the least expensive place that would cater her wedding, and she found online a place that was cheapest per plate. And she went through online all the questions, like, oh, what do you want to serve? When do you want to serve it? What type of utensils do you want? She answered all these questions, got everything all figured out. And then at the end of it, she finds out that there is also a booking fee. And with the booking fee, the cost is actually more for this place that she thought was cheaper than the other places that she'd priced out. But at this point, she was already invested, and she just went with it. The place lowballed her into paying more than she wanted to, and more than she would have otherwise. With lowball, you try to snowball. Most of us know how to make a snowman. You start with a snowball and you roll it, you roll it, you roll it till it's a bigger ball. This is how lowball technique works. Start by getting people to agree to something small, and you try to grow it. Now that they're invested, now that they have an invested inner context, you try to grow it, you grow it, you grow it. Get them to agree to something they wouldn't have agreed to otherwise if you had asked them from the start to agree to that. So the difference between the foot in the door and the lowball approach is that foot in the door involves independent multiple things, so a small transaction that ends, but you've established a reciprocal relation with the person, then you come back and you can do bigger business with the person. But lowball says, okay, I've got you on the hook, gonna see what the most I can get out of you is. The opposite of a lowball strategy is called the door-in-the-face strategy, where a very bad thing is offered first in order to make what follows, the actual offer, seem better. So if you want to build a 10-story building in a town where you know that the locals will object, I might tell them that I want to build a 20-story building so they can think that they talked me down to 10. Because as we learned in lecture, comparison is king. These are some of the new concepts from this lecture, most of which could likely be used for the written assignment, provided you come across in your personal experience a good example of it in something you hear or see in real life, the internet, television, etc., and provided you can clearly and interestingly articulate how the example from your personal experience is a good instance of the concept. The short reading gave us 5 rules of fair play to remind us of the importance of context and to manage the biasing effect that our personal or inner context can have on our interpretations and our willingness to engage in reasoning. Next lecture deals with making our beliefs testable and having beliefs worth testing. Stay tuned and happy thinking.